There is a rule that has governed almost every major American city ever built, and it is simple enough to see on any map. New York grew from the Atlantic, Chicago from Lake Michigan, and New Orleans from the mouth of the continent's entire drainage network. In the 18th and 19th centuries, water moved goods at scale, and the cities that controlled water controlled wealth. A city built without it had almost no obvious path to national importance. Indianapolis is one of the largest American cities built without a useful, navigable waterway. It was founded in 1820 on a site that every serious student of American urban history would have walked away from. A shallow, commercially unviable river cutting through a mosquito-infested forest with no natural connection to any major trade route on the continent. The men who chose it did so because it sat near the middle of the map, and for a state capital, that was enough. By every rule that had ever produced a great American city, Indianapolis should have quietly failed and been forgotten. So why exactly hasn't it? In 1820, the Indiana General Assembly appointed 10 commissioners with a single instruction: locate the geographic center of the state and build the capital there. The reasoning was purely administrative, a way of equalizing travel times for citizens arriving from every corner of Indiana. What the commissioners found at the confluence of the White River and Fall Creek was a dense, swampy forest infested with mosquitoes, actively hostile and offering nothing that the rules of city building said you needed. The state brought in Alexander Rolleston, a Scottish engineer who had previously assisted Pierre Charles L'Enfant in planning Washington, D.C. to design the new city. Rolleston drew what became known as the Mile Square, an unusually wide street grid with roads 90 to 120 feet across, and a central governor's circle from which diagonal avenues radiated outward like spokes. The design was rational and deeply ambitious, drawn for a city that had no mechanism for connecting to the outside world. The founders understood this, and their response was to pretend otherwise. When the Indiana General Assembly officially declared the White River navigable in 1820, it was legal fiction dressed as optimism. The river was shallow and incapable of supporting commercial traffic. In 1831, a steamboat called the Robert Hanna arrived in Indianapolis to enormous public fanfare, and the city celebrated as though its geographic isolation was finally over. The Robert Hanna ran aground on its return trip and was stranded for weeks, and no commercial steamboat ever successfully completed the journey again. The city had built an elegant grid, declared its river navigable, and was sitting in the middle of a swamp with no way out. The next solution was even more ambitious and far more expensive. In 1836, Indiana launched the Mammoth Internal Improvement Act, authorizing $10 million in public works spending to build a canal network connecting Indianapolis to navigable waterways. The scale of the commitment was staggering. The debt represented 1/6 of the entire state's wealth at a time when annual tax revenue was less than $65,000. The Panic of 1837 arrived before the canals were finished. Projects stalled as engineering problems multiplied and funding collapsed. By 1841, Indiana was effectively bankrupt, handing over most of its unfinished infrastructure to London creditors in exchange for debt reduction. The canals were abandoned, and Indianapolis remained isolated, muddy, and increasingly indistinguishable from a failed experiment in frontier planning. What happened next reshaped the city in a way nobody intended. The Indiana Constitution of 1851 included Article 10, Section 5, a provision that strictly prohibited the state from ever contracting public debt again. Every future ambition would need to be financed through deals and incentives rather than borrowed money. The canal disaster had forced a financial discipline on Indianapolis that it never would have chosen for itself, and that discipline, born from the city's worst failure, would turn out to matter more than any canal ever could have. The canal era rested on a fixed assumption that waterways were the only viable mechanism for moving goods at scale, and that cities without water access were simply out of the game. The railroad dissolved that assumption entirely. Rail needed flat, open land, and Indianapolis sat in the center of one of the flattest states in the Union, with open land extending for hundreds of miles in every direction. The geographic liability that had defined the city's first 3 decades became, almost overnight, a blank canvas. The first train arrived from Madison in 1847. Within a few years, rail lines were radiating out from Indianapolis in every direction. Following almost precisely the spoken wheel pattern Rolston had drawn on his original city plan. In 1853, Indianapolis opened the first Union Station in the United States, a single shared terminal where all competing rail lines converged. By 1910, more than 200 trains a day passed through the city, enough to paralyze the downtown core at grade level. And between 1915 and 1922, the city elevated all 12 tracks on concrete overpasses to preserve the downtown rather than surrendering it. The city that had been stranded by a shallow river had become the crossroads of America. This is the first great paradox of Indianapolis. The very thing that should have killed it, the absence of navigable water, became its greatest structural advantage. Unconstrained by a coastline or river valley, it expanded in a near-perfect circle outward, infrastructure reaching in every direction simultaneously. The pattern Rolston had drawn had become the skeleton of an industrial city, but what it had not yet become was a city with an identity. By 1910, Indianapolis was the fourth largest automobile producer in the United States. Public roads were too rutted for high-speed testing, so in 1909, a group of local businessmen, led by entrepreneur Carl Fisher, built a massive oval track on the outskirts of the city. After a deadly initial race on crushed stone and tar, Fisher had the surface repaved with 3.2 million bricks in 63 days. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway could hold more than 300,000 spectators, making it the highest capacity sports venue in the world by a factor of nearly 2. The race they created, the Indianapolis 500, became the largest single-day sporting event on the planet, and the Speedway now generates more than $1 billion in annual economic activity, with the month of May accounting for more than $500 million of that. The Speedway even helped anchor its own town, Speedway, Indiana, established in 1912 as a residential and industrial suburb around the track and nearby auto-related factories, including Presto Light, which had moved after dangerous acetylene explosions and city restrictions. The Indy 500 gave Indianapolis something it had never had, a reason for people outside Indiana to know it existed. What it could not give the city was a diversified economy, and when the manufacturing era began to falter, that gap would matter enormously. The thing that would eventually fill it had been growing on the east side of town since 1876, almost entirely unnoticed by the rest of the country. In 1876, a Civil War veteran named Colonel Eli Lilly opened a pharmaceutical company in a small building with 3 employees. In 1923, Eli Lilly became the first company to successfully mass-produce insulin commercially, one of the most consequential medical achievements of the 20th century. In 1956, the company manufactured 68% of the national supply of the Salk polio vaccine. These moments changed the course of modern medicine, and they happened in Indianapolis. The Lilly Endowment, established in 1937, grew to nearly $80 billion in assets by 2024 and became the financial engine behind nearly every major civic initiative in the city's modern history. From sports facilities and downtown redevelopment to the world's largest children's museum, which draws more than 1 million visitors per year and remains virtually unknown outside Indiana. Eli Lilly's presence attracted an entire ecosystem of biotech startups, research hospitals, and medical device manufacturers, making Indianapolis one of the most significant life sciences clusters in the world. Salesforce established its second-largest global office downtown, and the city is home to 3 Fortune 500 companies and 8 university campuses. None of that insulated Indianapolis from what was coming in the 1960s, when the same forces hollowing out Detroit and St. Louis arrived at its doorstep, and the city had to decide whether it would fight or follow the same path everyone else had taken. By the 1960s, Indianapolis was in serious trouble. Manufacturing jobs were leaving, downtown was hollowing out, and residents with money were crossing the city limits into the suburbs and taking their tax dollars with them. The city government was tangled in dozens of overlapping authorities, leaving it fragmented and fiscally weak. Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis and a dozen other Midwestern cities were facing the same pressures, and most followed the same trajectory toward shrinking tax bases, deteriorating services, and eventual collapse. In 1970, Mayor Richard Lugar worked through the Indiana state legislature to consolidate the city government with the surrounding Marion County in a maneuver called Unigov. The city's territory expanded from 82 to 400 square miles. Its population nearly doubled, and its tax base absorbed the suburban wealth that had been draining across the old city limits. The consolidated government strengthened Indianapolis's borrowing position, giving it more room to finance major redevelopment projects than most of its struggling Rust Belt peers. Where every other Rust Belt city watched its wealthiest residents cross the city line and disappear into the suburbs, Indianapolis reached out and moved the line around them. This is the second great paradox of Indianapolis. While other cities were slowly being drained by their own geography, Indianapolis simply redrew the map, and that decision prevented the catastrophic fiscal collapse that would consume Detroit and hollow out St. Louis over the following decades. What Indianapolis had not yet figured out was what to do with all of that firepower. It had the territory, the tax base, and the credit to rebuild. What it still needed was an idea worth building around. Indianapolis could not compete with Chicago for financial services, with New York for culture, or with Los Angeles for entertainment, because those races had been over for decades. So its civic leadership made a deliberate decision to compete somewhere no other major American city was competing seriously. It would become the amateur sports capital of the world. The city poured hundreds of millions of dollars into world-class athletic infrastructure and created the Indiana Sports Corporation, a nonprofit with a single mission to bring every major sporting event in the world to Indianapolis. The anchor of the strategy was the National Collegiate Athletic Association, then headquartered in Kansas City. Indianapolis assembled a $50 million package and offered a campus at White River State Park on a lease of $1 per year. The association moved, and since 1999 has generated more than $1 billion in economic impact, while guaranteeing men's and women's Final Four tournaments on an average cycle of every 5 years. The city went on to host the Super Bowl, the Final Four, the Big Ten Championship, and the Pan American Games, and is the permanent home of the National Football League Scouting Combine. Lucas Oil Stadium, Gainbridge Fieldhouse, and Victory Field are all within walking distance of each other, in the heart of downtown, surrounded by hotels, restaurants, and one of the largest convention centers in the country. The entire downtown core was transformed into a highly efficient campus designed to absorb hundreds of thousands of visitors at a time. The sports strategy gave Indianapolis a second identity and a rebuilt downtown, but what it actually produced was something far more durable than any stadium, because Indianapolis sits within a one-day drive of 70% of the American population, and because interstates 65, 69, 70, and 74 all converge within its city limits. It has one of the densest interstate crossroads of any American metro area. The Indianapolis International Airport is home to one of Federal Express's largest hubs. Often described as the company's second largest in the United States, processing 1.5 million packages every single night. Alongside the standard high-volume distributors, the city runs highly specialized, temperature-controlled pharmaceutical operations for companies like Eli Lilly and Roche, infrastructure that requires years of regulatory investment to build, and that most cities have never had reason to develop. The spoken wheel street grid turned out to be the ideal template for the 21st century logistics economy. The city placed at the center of Indiana so that state legislators would have equal travel times has become 200 years later one of the central nodes of the American supply chain. Indianapolis has no ocean, Great Lake, or natural harbor, and by every geographic principle that governed American urban development for 3 centuries, it should be a modest regional center serving the surrounding agricultural economy and not much else. Instead, it is the home of the world's largest single-day sporting event, the permanent headquarters of the governing body of American college athletics, a global center for pharmaceutical research and insulin production, and one of the largest air cargo hubs in the Federal Express network. Every one of those outcomes was produced by specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments when the easier path was to accept the city's limitations and manage the decline. Indianapolis treated each of its limitations as a constraint to engineer around rather than a condition to survive. The people who built it never made much noise about what they were doing, and the city still carries that quality. It will tell you about the Indy 500. It will not tell you that it is one of the more instructive examples of urban survival in modern American history. Indianapolis does not make any sense, and yet, by every measure that matters, it has outlasted cities that had every advantage it never did.